Hello, good evening. مساء الخير. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Rabab Abdel Hadi. I'm the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State University. And this is our discussion on white nationalists and Zionist alliances and rising authoritarianism. Before I start, I would like to first acknowledge that my university, San Francisco State, sits on native space and on the land of Ramaytush Ohlone people and of the coastal Miwok. Whether we live, study, or work in the Bay Area, our presence on indigenous ancestral territories expects us to recognize the fact that we are all beneficiaries of indigenous disposition. Learning how about indigenous history and enduring presence in the Great Bay Area is but a baby step toward correcting these wrongs and supporting land back for indigenous people. I make this acknowledgement as an indigenous Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, woman of color, feminist, and activist whose land is colonized by Israeli settler colonialism, where it is essential for anybody who visits, lives, or studies on the indigenous land of Palestine, all of Palestine, to not only acknowledge whose land it is, but no matter how long or short they stay, their presence must be validated by the indigenous people of the land if they do not wish to be defined as settlers. I also want to take time to ask you to stop for a moment of silence to honor all those martyrs who fell in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, Iraq, Kashmir, the streets of the United States, South Africa, Puerto Rico, Vietnam, Cuba, Congo, Sudan, and anywhere and everywhere in the world. We honor them, we remember the martyrs who have fallen a long time ago and those who have just recently fell for our people's struggle. Learning about the genocide that's ongoing, seeing children starving and unable to even get a drink of water, seeing over 1,000 families completely decimated, perhaps allows us to concretize what might seem as a theoretical discussion between the relationship between white supremacy and Zionism. When we think of the human toll that makes the losses real and concrete and on the ground, nothing about this is solely an exercise in theoretical or luxurious study. And nothing in our theoretical study is just a luxury without action that we do. It's alarming how much all of this killing is actually being justified and celebrated. And this is what our speakers will be talking about. Before I just go on, I want to thank our sponsors, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, the let me just ping to make the screen bigger, the International, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, ASATA, Ahmed Studies, the Right to Reject Zionism, Feminists for Justice in and for Palestine, the Palestine Arab Muslim Caucus of the California Faculty Association, and Teaching Palestine Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice. And I'm not going to take more time because we have incredible and amazing speakers and presenters. I will intervene when we get to the point, but I want to, this comes as a result of a growing coalition that this comes in order to connect, to reflect on a growing coalition that unites Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and Zionism in the US. That is a reflection of the ideology and goals of Zionism, as well as policies and practices of the State of Israel. Despite the ways in which Zionist organizations and Israel weaponize anti-Semitism, in reality, they have deep alliances with anti-Semitism forces, including white nationalism and Christian supremacists, as you will see. Further, Israel arms and collaborates with authoritarian regimes against their own civilians and people's movement. The Islamophobic alliances between Zionists and Hindutva, Hindu-fascist groups in the US is similarly a reflection of their shared interests. This webinar will share, or this Zoom connection will share the historical and current nature and agendas of their alliances. Our presenters, we will start with our sister Aisha A, who is a Pakistani Muslim organizer raised in the Bay Area. She's been a member of the Alliance of South Asian Taking Action, ASATA, for a little over 5 years now, and currently serves as a co-lead for the Palestine Solidarity Working Group. ASATA is a San Francisco Bay Area all-volunteer grassroots group working to educate, organize, and empower the Bay Area South Asian community to end violence, oppression, racism, and exploitation within and against the diverse communities. And I should say, like the history of Palestine that did not start with October 7th, Assad has also been working for a very long time. Our second speaker is Dr. Jenny Kelly, who is an associate professor of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research broadly engages questions of settler colonialism, U.S. empire, and the fraught politics of both tourism and solidarity. Her first book, Invited to Witness Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine from Duke University Press, that came out last year, 2023, is a multi-sided interdisciplinary study of solidarity tourism in Palestine that shows how solidarity tourism has emerged in Palestine as an ongoing strategy that is both embedded in and working against histories of sustained displacement. Her next project, co-edited with Sandeep Sen, from Rothschild University and Leila Sharif, Arizona State University, is Detours, a decolonial guide to Palestine. This is the next volume in the Detour series at Duke University Press, after the inaugural Detours, a decolonial guide to Hawaii. She is also a founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and my colleague there, and University of California, Santa Cruz Faculty for Justice in Palestine. And our last but not least speaker is Sarah Kirshner, who is the co-founder and international coordinator of the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, established in 2007. Sarah began her Palestinian solidarity work during the Second Intifada, or Al-Aqsa Intifada, in 2000. Sarah is also co-founder of Generation 5, an organization working on transformative justice approaches to address child sexual abuse and works towards prison abolition in solidarity with currently and formerly incarcerated people. After her father tested positive for HIV, Sarah began her organizing and social justice work in the movement to reduce drug-related harm. And Sarah and I also go way back in our organizing for justice and for Palestine. I'm very honored and pleased to introduce our three scholar activists or organic intellectuals, and I introduce them together because they will be presenting together as a collective in their discussion and presentation, and we'll raise questions afterwards. Please listen carefully, take notes, prepare your comments, and I will invite you to speak.
Thank you, Rabab. Thank you so much for holding this panel and for opening it. And I know everyone who is here in good faith on this Zoom, we're here both with a lot of grief and rage about what is happening right now, and holding the contradiction of the growing masses and growing power behind Palestine, while we're also watching this devastation and the dying grasp of Zionism in Israel brutalize the entire region, as it has before, but with a sort of different intention. And I think this conversation that we're going to have today really is important in that it demonstrates that Zionism has always been a fascist project. And what we're seeing is an escalation in that fascism an ongoing expansion of its colonization and genocide as its methodology. And it's not alone in that. And that is the basis of our joint struggle. And it is also the basis of the alliances we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by sharing our premise, which is that Zionism is an ideology of racial and ethnic supremacy. And it has been since deep in the roots in the establishment of the Zionist Congress in 1898. And it shares a lot in common with other forms of supremacy. And what we're going to be looking at today is the supremacy inherent in Zionism, white nationalism, and Hindutva or Hindu fascism. And so as outlined here, in addition to sharing a supremacist belief of superiority over other ethnicities or religious groups, they also use similar methods to enact their supremacist beliefs, which include genocide, ethnic cleansing, vigilante and state violence. They work together, whether in the United States, in India, or in Palestine. The settlers are state-sanctioned vigilante violence in the same way that white nationalists have historically and are currently state-sanctioned to some degree or completely, depending on the more explicitly or less explicitly, depending on the administration. Its roots are in European colonialism and white supremacy and racism. In the case of Zionism and white nationalism, that includes anti-Semitism for all three. That includes Islamophobia. And it serves the interests of right-wing authoritarian governments and regimes. That all of those fascist ideologies align with the governments that allow them to continue. And then finally, what we were talking about when we were building this and also are having more conversations about in terms of Zionism is the ways in which Zionism, white nationalism, and Hindutva leverage and exploit fundamentalist religion, like colonization itself, right? It was very advanced by the Christian and Catholic Church, European colonialism, and now in the case of Israel, there are threads within Judaism that, when expressed fundamentally as fundamentalist religions, support Zionism, but they are all fundamentally projects of empire building, imperialism, and racial apartheid and colonization. So the reason we are talking about these alliances and how they work together is that our solidarity with each other across people's movements and for collective liberation are not just ideological, and they're not just on principle, they're practical. Our enemies are in an alliance together and against us, and therefore our solidarity is the only thing. Our joint struggle, our practical work together is the only thing that will secure victory for any of our struggles. And that's really why we're sharing this information, is to reinforce that Zionism, whether it's liberal Zionism or right-wing Zionism, has no place in our movements, just as white nationalism doesn't, just as Hindutva doesn't, just as Christian hegemony and supremacy don't. And that struggling against Zionism is part of our collective liberation on all these fronts mentioned here. And this picture is Third World Resistance, which is a coalition that's existed in the Bay Area for about 15 years that Asata and IJAN are part of, and many other organizations as well. So many of you know this, but it feels important to say that what we are seeing now from the state of Israel and Zionist organizations is in the very founding of the state itself and in the Zionist movements in its roots. And Jabotinsky, who is one of the founding fathers of the Zionist movement, and also is the founder most regarded by the presidents and prime ministers of Israel since its founding, is Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky was very clear about the aspirations of the Zionist movement. And this quote speaks to his clarity. And so I'm not going to read the quote out loud, but if you go on to read, this is from a piece called The Iron Wall, who Jabotinsky looks to as the model that Zionists should use for colonization is the United States and the European colonial process, which was a massive genocide of 30 million people, right, across the Americas over time. The point being that Jabotinsky was actually speaking to liberal Zionists or labor Zionists when he wrote this. He said, you can fool yourself into believing that there is a kinder, gentler colonization, but colonization is brutal and its intents are to wipe out the indigenous population. And any lesson in history shows you that the indigenous population will resist. And therefore, our policy has to be complete militarization. And that is exactly what Israel has done and has been since before its founding, when Zionists were more militia who would rove around and try to ethnically cleanse Palestinian villages even before the founding of the State of Israel. And so the roots of Zionism, rather than its claim of being any resolution of the eugenics and racism of Europe, it's just an advance of it. Its roots are colonialism, they are fascism, it is the Orientalist racist views of non-Western people. It is ethnic and cultural nationalism of the fascist period of Europe. And of course, it's also anti-Semitic, this belief that Jews are only safe in isolation. And then it was importantly anti-revolutionary, anti-working class. And this is important to understand because the role that Israel plays for the United States and India or other countries that it arms is that it is supporting the maintenance of a 1% elite against a 99%. And those of us who are anti-Zionist are part of building the power of the 99% against the 1%, which is not to say that within the 99%, we know there are divisions and there is leveraging in every direction, including Zionism. But Zionism is a movement of the elite against the many. And I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but part of Zionism's fascism is also that it always sought to collaborate with anti-Semites, because the people who wanted power in a Jewish colonial state in Palestine or the other places they explored to establish a Jewish state, they really didn't care how many Jews were sacrificed for that, as long as they were able to establish a state where they could have power and be part of the global power of empires and imperialism. And there are many examples of that, from the courting of czars to the courting of Balfour, who was a renowned anti-Semite and signed it to get what he called the Bolshevik Jews out of the UK, to breaking the boycott against Nazis. Zionists broke that first, to transfer agreements in which Zionist leadership in different parts of Europe would help round up Jews, to agreements with the Argentina junta, which was explicitly anti-Semitic and a fascist regime, to, as you will hear from Jenny, today's partnership with Christian Zionists. So Zionism has always been and continues to be about Jewish supremacy and an alliance with white supremacists, European colonialists, which the Jewish people who led the Zionist movement were themselves European colonizers. So the Zionist support for U.S. white supremacist leaders. Since Trump's first stint in office and during this election, we are seeing the ways in which Zionists are increasingly aligning with extreme right-wing and white nationalist politics. The Zionist Organization of America welcomed Bannon to speak. And then Donald Trump recently spoke at the Israel America Alliance, which created a lot of controversy, but mostly from Zionist organizations, it's really just a performance, because in reality, they have shared interests with the Trump administration, but also with neoliberal administrations like Biden, which is not the topic for today, but it's not to be forgotten. Zionists have supported white supremacist leaders. I mean, John Hagee, who's with Kufi, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from Jenny as I turn this over. His quote, one of his famous quotes is that God sent Adolf Hitler to help Jews reach the promised land, which in fact Zionists capitalized on. But as you will hear more about, the goals of Christian Zionists are the complete elimination of Jewish people, and Christian Zionists provide the most money and the most numbers in support of Israel, which all Zionist, Jewish Zionist organizations and Israeli governments accept. So I'm going to turn this over shortly to Jenny to say more of that, but the reverse is also true. So we will also hear Christian Zionists and white supremacists clout the Zionist colonial project in the same way Jabotinsky lifted up the US colonial project as a successful model of European domination over indigenous and quote unquote developing countries. And so they are very clear and very explicit about their alliances, about the commonalities in their interests and struggles. And our job is to be similarly clear in our actions and our speech and not avoid the reality of Zionism and the state of Israel. And so finally, as we said in the beginning, sorry, before I turn this over to Jenny, that specifically in the United States, and then we'll hear more about how Hindutva loops into this around the Islamophobia agenda and also the 1%, is they, of course, share Islamophobia in common. They share an investment in U.S. might and weaponization and military power. They partnered with dictators in Central and South America and all over the world, leading to mass displacement and genocides, border surveillance and the wall, domestic repression and surveillance. Israel is the #1 creator of drones. Our police are trained by the Israeli army in population control, which of course gets expressed almost totally on BIPOC, queer, trans, disabled communities here, but also on protesters and people's movements. And then they collaborate and have historically collaborated on targeting people's movement all over the world. And then whitewashing histories of fascism and white supremacy. And as Rabab knows only too well, one of the biggest agendas they share on campus is trying to dismantle ethnic studies and critical race theory, because that is a primary objective of any white supremacist, right, or Jewish supremacist project, is to make invisible the histories that they benefit from. So with that, I'm going to pause and turn it over to Jenny Kelly, but I didn't know, Rabab, if there's anything you want to say in that transition before we do.
Thank you so much, Sarah. No, I'll save. I have a lot of things to say, but I'll save my comments till later. Thank you so much for a lot of food for thought. And people who are writing in the chat, keep writing. We'll discuss all your questions. Please, Jenny, take over, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for bringing us together. And I always learn so much from you and some of my other co-panelists. Just thank you all for being in this space, doing this work. And Rabab, always, it's such an honor to work alongside all of you. So I'm going to talk to you about Christian Zionism. I'm going to start with what Sarah referenced, which was John Hagee's appearance on November 14th, 2023, amidst this genocidal bombing campaign against Gaza that was then in its 38th day. As we know now, it is in its 381st day. At the March for Israel in Washington, D.C., they headlined John Hagee as one of their central speakers. He's a conservative American evangelical pastor, the founder of CUFI, Christians United for Israel, the flagship Christian Zionist organization in the U.S. CUFI, in step with scores of other Christian Zionist organizations, have beat the drum for war in and against Palestine since its inception. I'm going to cover three things today, briefly, but of course, I'm happy to answer anything else or talk more about anything else in the Q&A afterwards. What I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the history and narrative logics of U.S. Christian Zionism, the role Christian Zionist travel plays in entrenching Israeli state violence, and Christian Zionist support for the IRA definition, which the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which I'll talk more about. And what these 3 points reveal is the entrenchment of Christian Zionism in the global right discourse. So CUFI's entire platform is predicated on stamping out any and all criticism of Israel, quashing international pressure on Israel to comply with international law, opposing the BDS movement as, quote, economic anti-Semitism. Central to this work that they do is support of the IRA definition. CUFI boasts that they have worked to see the IRA definition adopted at the federal level and targets each state capital to see it adopted across the country. In this way, through a focus on Christian Zionist organizing in the US, its use of tourism to both galvanize its followers and simultaneously displace Palestinians, and its support of the IRA definition, what I'll argue and what I'll talk about today is how Christian Zionism is a central player in the displacement of Palestinians in Palestine and the suppression of academic freedom in the US. It's worth noting that Christian Zionism does not go uncontested within Christian communities. Christian Palestinian organizers, educators, guides, and hosts in Palestine, and Christian anti-Zionist pastors and congregants in the US routinely and tirelessly work to reshape what Umayya Cable calls compulsory Zionism among so many Christian communities. Christian Zionism has a really deep and pervasive US history. So in the early 20th century, Christian Zionism began to have a really strong purchase in the US through the American dispensational movement and became ubiquitous within evangelical denominations. The core theological belief is this. Following the work of 19th century Christian dispensationalist Cyrus Ingerson Schofield, Christian dispensationalist premillennialists believe that there will be a rapture in which God will physically remove all of his true believers alive and dead from earth, and they will immediately ascend to heaven. After said rapture, the Antichrist will reign throughout a period of 7 years of tribulation, during which all of the biblical prophecies of the book of Revelation will be fulfilled. After the period of tribulation, we will witness the second coming of Christ, who will do battle with his chosen people, Christians and converted Jews, against the Antichrist in Israel. Premillennialist theology also maintains that after the rapture, 144,000 Jews will convert to Christianity, and this conversion will reveal to them the true intentions of the Antichrist. And after those 7 years of tribulations, Jesus Christ will return with the help of converted Jews, quote, defeat and imprison Satan and establish a messianic kingdom on earth for a period of 1 millennium. The premillennialism thus designates a belief that the rapture takes place before the millennium of Christ's rule, while dispensationalism refers to distinct dispensations or periods in history, each of which marks a separate moment in the relationship between humans and God. So scholars of US empire have noted that politically after 1967, and in tandem with, and of course, with many of the same actors as Jerry Falwell's moral majority in the 70s and 80s, evangelical Christian political mobilizing turned outward. So this turn took the shape of what Susan Harding has described as a window of progressive history in the unfolding of end times, where Christian premillennialists maintained that world history is hopelessly regressive, careening into Satan's maw, and it may seem as if America's plummeting down that same dark tunnel, but not if Christians act now. So this is when their mobilizing took the shape of transnational political work. Israel's land grabs in 1967 gave Christian Zionists a renewed faith in biblical prophecy, with US evangelicals thrilled that, in the words of L. Nelson Bell, who was a Presbyterian missionary who profoundly influenced the Christian right, quote, "For the first time in more than 2,000 years, Jerusalem is now completely in the hands of the Jews, delivering a renewed faith in the accuracy and validity of the Bible." For decades, the calls for war, the enthusiasm for violence, the desire to see Palestinians fully displaced is situated at this intersection of the exhilaration at biblical prophecy coming to life through death and the virulent racism of the Christian right. So what my second book project is going to do is map out these 5 decades of Christian Zionist mobilizing that have entrenched this US discursive and material support for Israeli state violence in the service of a deeply racialized Christian supremacy. And today I would just want to touch on the past and present role of travel in that history and what Christian Zionism has to do with repression on our campuses. A central tenet of Falwell's moral majority, founded in 1979, was the unequivocal support for Israel. By 1983, he began his first of many friendship tours to Israel. You can move to the next slide, which included meetings with top government officials, tours of Israeli battlefields and defense installations. Grace Halsall wrote a narrative of these tours in 83 and 85, and she wrote that for every hour they heard of Christ's teachings, they heard 30 hours of Israel's political and military achievements. His son, Jonathan Falwell, has since taken over the mantle. The Christian Zionist tour company he contracts with boasts of having hosted Jerry Falwell, Jonathan Falwell, Glenn Beck, Oliver North, Matt and Anita Staver, Mike Huckabee, Benny Tate, Ergen Kaner, Ed Hinson, Jerry Prevost, Benny Hinn, Joe Brown, Dino Karsanakis, Lester Hudson, Jed Leinbach, Terry Falkenberry, Liberty University, and so many more. So keeping in mind that this is one Christian Zionist tourist agency among countless, they also write, "We have led thousands of people on tour with churches, Christian missionaries, political and television personalities, advocacy organizations, and college students for credit. After the 9/11 attacks, we took a number of law enforcement officers to Israel for counterterrorism training," demonstrating not only the outreach across political positions, ministries and colleges, but also the entrenchment of US policing trainings in Israel in the service of post 9/11 war on terror, or more accurately, war of terror, expansion of militarized policing. Christian Zionism tours today, which are manifold, follow Falwell's template, pairing pilgrimage to the Holy Land with celebrations of Israeli military violence and sustained displacement of Palestinians. I'm going to share with you just one example. Currently, there's a biblical theme park run by settlers that is planned and being executed in Silwan, the eastern part of occupied Jerusalem. You can move to the next slide. It comprises a cable car, a 7-story Jewish cultural center on top of Wadi Hilwa land, shopping centers, and homes for settlers. The park, even in its incomplete iteration as an archaeological park, attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists per year. A snapshot of the narrative logics and material violence of the tour is here in a snapshot of its virtual iteration. Arabic street names have of course been turned into Hebrew. Streets have been collapsed under Palestinian homes because of the tunnels dug underneath for tourist paths. One reporter has written, "It wasn't until the parking lot caved in that the locals were able to look into the hole below and discover what the state had been excavating for many years without disclosing to its residents. A first-century pilgrim's path leading from the Pool of Siloam up to the Old City, directly beneath the homes of Palestinians." The settler group Elad, funded by the late Sheldon Adelson, runs these excavations with state support and has worked to exile Palestinian families from their homes since the early 90s. Adelson, too, was one of the largest donors to Birthright, Talit Birthright, the state-sanctioned Zionist tourism initiatives free for Jewish youth that erase Palestinian presence and celebrate Israeli military violence. A regular stop on Birthright tours is the City of David Park. So is this biblical theme park, funded by settlers and Christian Zionists supporting them. In June 21, amidst Israel's last bombing campaign against Gaza, Leila Sakur described the demolition orders given to residents of Al Bustan and Silwan across 100 properties, 1,550 people, with plans to repopulate.
Jenny, can I interrupt you just to ask you to slow down a little bit? Because
Yeah.
people are having a hard time. I'm asking them to turn on their closed captioning because they can see the text, but also because you're also giving a lot of dense material. So if you
Of
can
course.
just make it slower. Thank you.
Of course. So the biblical city of David, what I was mentioning here is, and this is the image simulated by the organization to depict the cable car planned for the old city, is essentially, and I'm glad you asked me to slow down because it's so crucial to understand the connection between Christian Zionist tourism and displacement of Palestinians in Jerusalem. So not only is this whole tourism project in this biblical theme park essentially burrowing under the ground, shaking the foundations of Palestinians' homes, evicting entire neighborhoods, but it's also done with the plan of a full-scale and complete eviction of further Palestinians. Part of what we're witnessing on such a large scale, right? A continuation of an ongoing Nakba that has, since its inception, had the goal of having Palestinian land without Palestinians on it. So Sheldon Adelson was one of the largest donors, right, to this and to Birthright. So Birthright is a tourism initiative, right? Birthright is a state-sanctioned Zionist tourism initiative that brings Jewish youth for free, erases Palestinian presence, is often sort of understood to erase Israeli militarism, but what it actually does is celebrate Israeli militarism. Tours are led by IDF soldiers. Israeli state violence is celebrated through Birthright tourism. A regular stop on Birthright tours is the biblical city of David Park. So again, in June 21, against another bombing campaign against Gaza, the demolition orders were to sanction the eviction of 1,550 people across 100 properties, plans to repopulate the entire Silwan neighborhood with 25,000 settlers. As always, and this is common practice, residents were told to demolish their own homes or pay a fine of $6,000. Leila Sakur wrote at that time. The plan for the replacement of the Al Bustan in Gan Hamelech Park, billed as a new biblical theme park for the city of Jerusalem, which is to be linked to the pre-existing City of David National Park. The development plan includes archaeological excavations culminating in the restoration of the park, the planting of a blooming garden, a touristic zone complete with restaurants, galleries, and museums, as well as a new residential neighborhood for settlers. She notes in particular that the narrative peddled to tourists through this architecture is one of continuity. From the visitor center to tours of the land, international tourists are presented with a history that is exclusively biblical, erasing a long Palestinian heritage and contemporary urban life, and implying a shame that the Holy Land is being used and possessed by non-Jews, both projecting a narrative of linear continuity and museumizing the area, making it easier to imagine a land without a people. So, in short, tourism is never a thing apart from colonial state violence. As countless scholars in colonial studies have shown, tourism often follows the path of colonial state violence or precipitates it, paving the way for the justificatory logics of colonialism. This archaeological site is not only a tourist attraction for Christian Zionist tourists, it's also an extension of Sheldon Adelson's other investments in Christian Zionism. Adelson, who funded money into Alad, the settler organization, and famously once said that he's a one-person issue, and that issue is Israel. He donated $4.6 million to Kufi, to Christians United for Israel, between 2012 and his death in 2021. Since its inception, Kufi, in step with all of these other Christian Zionist organizations, CUFI is just one, right, have beat the drum for war, have expressed unbridled enthusiasm at the displacement of Palestinians, which we witness now. In a March 11, 2007 speech to AIPAC, made possible by this 2-decade-old alliance between the Christian right and AIPAC, by then 2-decade alliance, CUFI founder John Hagee, the same person who was invited to speak 38 days into this genocide, referred to the United Nations as a political brothel and called for a preemptive strike on Iran. In 2007, in November, they sent out a congratulatory action alert missive that CUFI activists had sent over 14,500 emails to the White House and placed thousands more calls asking President Bush to not pressure Israel to make any territorial concessions in Annapolis. We are pleased to report, they wrote, that the Annapolis summit ended without any such pressure being placed on Israel. In fact, the summit was little more than an extended photo opportunity. So they routinely take credit for these acts that stop any concession of Palestinian land to Palestinians. This calls to mind a moment at the first Christian Zionist Congress held in Basel in the first Christian Zionist Congress held in Basel. Christian Zionists urged Israel to annex the West Bank, and an Israeli Jew in the audience protested that an Israeli poll showed that 1/3 of Israelis would be willing to trade territory seized in 1967 for peace with the Palestinians. Immediately, International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem, which for 20 years was housed in Edward Said's stolen family home, founder Willem van der Hoeven exclaimed, "We do not care what the Israelis vote. We care what God says, and God gave the land to the Jews." After which the Christian Zionists nearly unanimously passed the resolution. Here again is Christian Zionist adamant opposition to any concession of occupied land to Palestinians and their readiness to overwrite national and international policy in favor of their interpretation of divine providence in order to facilitate the second coming of Christ. My grandmother, a Christian Zionist Southern Baptist who would never have had the terms to call herself that, whose license plate read, "In case of rapture, this car will be unmanned," when alive would shrug and say, "Peace in Palestine, that will never happen until Jesus comes." These are not like ineffectual actors to shrug off and roll our eyes at, right? They're warmongering zealots with an enormous amount of political power in the US. In the words of Cheryl Nessel of Independent Jewish Voices and on the ICSZ founding collective with me of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, "We ignore Christians United for Israel at our peril." Lastly, I want to talk about our campuses and talk about IRA. So I want to connect this history of political power and embedded tourist initiatives to Christian Zionist forms of repression on pro-Palestinian speech, particularly via the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. The IRA definition directly censors Palestinians and Palestinian rights advocates as it positions any and all critiques of Israel as anti-Semitic. The definition hinges on silencing Palestinians and Palestinian solidarity organizers and academics, and its proponents laud its efficacy in shutting down speech in support of Palestine. So 7 of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism in the IRA definition center on shielding the state of Israel from critique and accountability. Christians United for Israel, which boasts 10 million members and has now adopted the mantle, the fight against anti-Semitism, claims outsized responsibility for having influenced 10 states in the US to adopt the IRA definition. In January 22, the states that had issued proclamations in support of the IRA definition were Alabama, Arkansas, Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia, Wyoming, Nevada, and Virginia was then on the way. Multiple outlets reported that the proclamations are a result of joint advocacy effort by Christians United for Israel, Jewish Federations of North America, the American Jewish Committee, and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. In January 21, CUFI's press release on IRA Remembrance, or International Holocaust Remembrance Day, CUFI Action Fund Chairwoman Sandra Parker spoke. "As one cannot defeat that which they are unwilling to define, we are working with states across the country to ensure that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism is acknowledged and appropriately utilized. In addition, we are working with educators to address the woeful state of Holocaust education in many school districts across the country. We will not stop until every child in America has a firm and personal understanding of the genocide by which all others are measured." This pairing of the IRA definition with educational political program that positions the Holocaust as the genocide by which all others are measured. The subtext is positioning Israel as the antidote to antisemitism. In the arena of education, that CUFI mobilizes their 10 million members to join Stand With Us and the AMCA initiative, for example, in policing K-12 education in California to make sure there's no mention of Palestine. Indeed, an IRA search and an ethnic studies search on their website yields many paired campaigns, each one working squarely to formalize and institutionalize the suppression of speech on Palestine. Lastly, it's important to note that these actors are not limited to the Christian right or the Israeli right, but include many actors and organizations who define themselves as liberal and progressive, in large part to peddle the perception that there's a diversity of opinion and diversity of perspectives in each of these direct action campaigns. And nor do these silencing campaigns stop as we move leftward in our analysis. Really, the mobilization of the rhetoric and policies that the global right entrench is pernicious and ubiquitous, and both sanctions and really facilitates the unbridled enthusiasm for genocidal warfare, the devastation that we are witnessing, and the silence that condones it. Again, to close, Christian Zionism does not go unchallenged. As Christian Zionist tourist agencies and settler sites have accelerated their campaigns of erasure, Christian travelers have simultaneously traveled to Palestine to unlearn the Zionism with which they were raised. And Christian Palestinians have generously taught tourists of all kinds about the heresy of Christian Zionism. The study then of both Christian Zionism and Christians who will not allow Christian Zionist war to be waged in their name asks that we study US Christian Zionism rather than we already assuming we know what it is and what it does, and foreground the role of travel actually within its orbit, both when it entrenches settler colonial state practice and when it demands and otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Can you, so many questions in my mind, but I'm going to resist and turn it over to Aisha to continue the circle of the presentation, and then I will raise some questions. So please, Aisha, please give us your presentation.
Assalamu alaikum, y'all. Yeah, there's been a lot of really great stuff mentioned. And inshallah, I won't go too fast through what I'm saying, but I also want to leave some time for us to be able to get into different questions. So this will be like a pretty high-level overview of the connections between Hindutva and Zionism. It's been decades of a relationship between the two fascist entities. And I know a lot of folks in this room already have a depth of knowledge they can share as well. And I just want to take a moment to credit Hindus for Human Rights and Severa. Both of these orgs are attributed for the political education I'll be sharing with you all today. And you can find both their websites linked on this slide, as well as a website for the org that I'm representing today, the Alliance of South Asians Taking Action, for folks that are looking to get organized locally in the Bay Area. Next slide. So at its core, Hindutva is a Hindu supremacist, essentially fascist ideology of religious ethno-nationalism, and it's pretty unapologetic about that. You'll also hear it go by the names of Hindu nationalism or Hindu supremacy, and there's a lot of literature by Hindutva proponents, and a lot of different things you can tackle, but at its core, there's these 3 points that are essentially always true, that Hindutva is used to homogenize Hinduism as like this singular religious, cultural, ethnic, and political identity. 2, it states that Hindus are the only indigenous group to India. And then the 3rd point is that India should be reconstituted as a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation, rather than a secular pluralistic democracy. And in this Hindu Rashtra, envisioned by Hindutva ideology, only Hindus, specifically those from dominant castes, are treated as full citizens, while other minorities like Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, aka caste oppressed folks, Adivasis, other caste oppressed communities, are relegated to second-class citizens or just expelled from India overall. And this Hindu nation doesn't just span what's modern-day India. It actually, as you see in that photo on the slide, spans the entire subcontinent, so places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, as well. And the Hindutva ideology was first articulated in the early 20th century by these two figures, V.D. Savgar and M.S. Goldwalker. I think something that's important to note that's actually pretty interesting is Savgar articulated the idea of Hindutva in a publication while he was imprisoned for being implicated in the murder of a British official during colonization. So his sort of radicalization came about under British imperialism. And this is important again because it feeds into this idea of Hindutva as this decolonial movement, even though we know that that is categorically untrue from the violence it perpetuates. But this framing is really important. In both Savgar's and Goldwalker's speeches and writings, these ideological fathers of Hindutva expressed extremely hateful views against India's non-Hindu minorities, such as Christians and Muslims, and also openly praised Nazis and Italian fascists. Despite the fact that Hindu has historically been a broad umbrella term encompassing an extremely diverse array of religious, spiritual, and philosophical traditions, the Hindutva project has always been constructed around a unified, cohesive national identity for Hindus that's articulated in caste, race, ethnicity, rather than merely religious grounds. So this identity is grounded in the idea of the Indian subcontinent as both like this spiritual and ethnic homeland for a so-called Hindu nation. And this homogenizing project means that Hindutva is an ideology of caste supremacy. As a part of its efforts to recast Hindu identity as this monolith, it reinforces the hegemony and supremacy of Brahmins, who sit at the top of India's caste hierarchy while erasing and suppressing traditions and practices of marginalized caste and indigenous communities. And for folks that are unfamiliar actually with caste, this is a system of social stratification within South Asia organized by caste, and at the top of this caste hierarchy are Brahmins. So the goal of Hindutva is not only to homogenize this Hindu identity, but to form it in the shape of a Brahmin identity. And in doing so, the goal is to invisibilize, marginalize, and fundamentally erase the ideas and traditions of caste-oppressed and indigenous folks. And the very last thing, sorry, in this brief summary of Hindutva, again, there's a lot more resources and readings we can share for folks, but Hindutva really takes shape and how it's in all these places in India. We have to look at the RSS, which is the primary political vehicle for Hindutva. So the RSS has this really vast sort of diffuse network, different organizations engaged in work, paramilitary work, education work. There's a network of mandirs, which are Hindu temples. And the RSS has around like 6 million members across India. And they've been directly implicated with a lot of countless instances of hate crimes against and deadly mass violence against caste oppressed communities, Muslims, other marginalized communities. And then the current ruling political party in India, the BJP, which is headed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. All of those folks in the BJP are current or former RSS members. So there's a lot of overlap and connection. And I guess even more context for folks that this is all super new to you. The RSS is actually the members of the RSS are the ones that assassinated Gandhi. If that's important historical context for folks to have, they essentially thought that he was too tolerant of Muslims and other minorities. And the RSS kind of sits at the center of these intricate networks, which we'll get into more in the next slide. Okay, so we're here talking about Zionism and white nationalism and the rise of authoritarianism. So what is this relationship between Hindutva and Zionism? I will say there is sometimes a tendency, as is the case in many activist circles, to kind of overstate some of the similarities between. There's certainly not a connection one-for-one between the two, but the reason why it's useful to think about these two ideologies in connection with one another is because Zionism as an ideology predates Hindutva as a fully formed political ideology by several decades. But if you look at the writings again of these early Hindutva figures, you really see an affinity towards the Zionist project. The phrases Goldwalker used was the reconstruction of the Hebrew nation in Palestine as a sort of evidence of his theory of a nationhood, and he saw the Zionist movement as an affirmation of that. And of course, like both of the early Hindutva figures also praised Nazism and fascism, so that there's not much to, like, yeah. In terms of how they see themselves and frame themselves, both Hindutva and Zionism are really reliant explicitly and unapologetically on the ideas of this like exclusionary religious ethno-state. And they reminisce on the like good old days when everything was great for their quote unquote marginalized folks. And they both call for more of like a militarized settler colonialism to a degree, especially when we're thinking about the Hindu Rashtra or what we're seeing in Kashmir. The proponents of both ideologies point to this like ancient past of Jewish and Hindu religions as this mythologized golden age that can only be returned through this establishment of an exclusionary ethno-state in the homeland of like Jewish Hindu people, which allows them to indulge in this fantasy that these are like decolonial ideologies. Both ideologies also share strong masculinist and militaristic frameworks in terms of like renewing the nation. And we're seeing this all quite evidently in the current ongoing genocide in Gaza, but this has obviously been true in occupied Palestine since Israel came into existence. We're also seeing it somewhat similarly since the formation of modern India, which actually happened to be more or less the exact time as Israel. It's very evident in India's treatment of occupied Kashmir, which is often referred to as the most militarized zone in the world. And I'd actually recommend folks, we don't have time today to get into it, but to look into Stand With Kashmir's website. They have a Kashmir syllabus where you can see more of the details of how these policies take root. Another way these policies take root is in central India, where communist and leftist folks are looking to hold on to Adivasi, like aka indigenous land, and the Hindutva forces have had like some pretty brutal retaliations against that. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can draw the analysis, but to show some of more similarities on those maps on this slide at the bottom, you can see one is the ideal Zionist state, which includes Jordan, parts of Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. And then same with the Hindu Rashtra, where it's not just India, but the expansion to places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And in terms of tracking, how did this happen? Because maybe some folks here know that India actually started out with pro-Palestine language in the 20th century, like publicly sided with Palestine. For example, in 1932, Gandhi had written that the Zionist displacement of Palestinian Arabs cannot be justified by any moral code of conduct. In the past decade, however, Hindu nationalism has become the dominant political ideology in India. And so as you see that rising, you also see a support of Zionism rising in tandem. And I recommend folks read the book Hostile Homelands, which documents this change. I'm going to say it in a much more reductive way of summarizing the book, but there's been a back-channel relationship and diplomacy that's existed since the inception of both countries. So you see in the early 50s and 60s, like arms sales, and then once you see it go public, it's more in like the 90s, where 91, I think India had revoked their vote on the United Nations resolution calling Zionism racist. And now fast forward all the way till today, we have India being the largest purchaser in the world for Israeli arms exports. And obviously underlying all of these warming ties has been the rise of Islamophobia, which is increasingly rampant in both India and Israel. Next slide. Now we've gotten to why this matters here in the belly of the beast in the US. So Hindutva may not hold the same explicit power here as it does in India, but it does and has existed for over 50 years in the US. The way it looks in the US is fairly similar to the way it looks in India because the ideology of Hindutva and the RSS have really been able to take root here. So here on the right, you see this Hindutva network map, and it's all linked pretty closely to the VHPA. But you can see it's a spread out network on purpose. Like they use this diffusion model intentionally because if one of the organizations or if like the education arm, the political action committee, like one of them say something that white liberals here see as explicitly racist or Islamophobic, the network can kind of come together and say like, oh, that doesn't represent our ideology. And it's important to recognize this model because this is also how Zionism has been able to take root in the US. This is intentional and strategic. And another example of how this network is diffused is with the example of the Hindu American Foundation, the HAF. And that really uses identity politics and postures as a progressive organization representing Hindus when they're strategically more sophisticated. And when it comes to American political dynamics, which is somewhat reminiscent of the ADL. So there's been 50 years of the VHPA in the US, originally founded in 1970. It's now grown to over a dozen chapters across the country. And one last thing that draws the parallels between Zionism and Hindutva here in the US is the idea of Hindu-phobia, and it being this explicit thing the same way Zionists have attempted to conflate like anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And Hindutva folks here are attempting to label any sort of valid critique of caste supremacist narratives and ethno-nationalism as Hindu-phobia. And I do want to be clear that whilst anti-Semitism is a form of structural oppression, Hindu-phobia is not. And last thing, Hindutva moves to the US. How it moves to the US has showed up on the far right as well. So we see the example of the VHPA member, Krishna Gudapati, who was at the January 6th insurrection and is still a very active member of his local VHPA. And the VHPA has closely partnered with a lot of far-right anti-Muslim extremists from the counter-jihadist movement, Pamela Geller, Stuart Kaufman, just like a bunch of folks that are calling for Muslim deportation, claim to be fighting against the Islamization of the US. And there's a pulling of Indian Americans to the far right more and more. We're actually seeing, like with Trump's from 2016 to 2020, a double in the share of Indian American voters. So this was all just really surface level things. I do want to like wrap up and save some time for us to get into like questions and open discussion. But I do really recommend, again, folks take a look at Hindus for Human Rights resources. We Are Severa also has a really in-depth report on the VHPA, as well as reading Hostile Homelands to get a better sense of these deep ties between India and Israel, and checking out the Kashmir syllabus from Stand with Kashmir. And yeah, sorry, that was really quick, but with that, I'll pass it back to Rabab. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the three of you. This is incredible. And there is so much material that you're giving. And for me, as an organizer and an educator, both are really great for me. So I'm kind of like, there's some of my students here. So this is great. So we'll have a lot of material to discuss. And many are organizers. So we kind of like think, okay, so what do we do with this material in our organizing? And many of us have been organizing for a very long time, working together. So I want to just give a couple of reactions, commentary. So first, I'm going to start with like personal reaction that Kofi, I knew Kofi since the first time Amsa attacked me and accused me of misuse of university funds, anti-Semitism, pro-terrorism, and so on, and messed up my sabbatical, messed up my reputation. And Kofi was always there again and again. Actually, Sarah would remember that because we were working on that campaign together, and IJAN and we and a whole bunch of other people produced this incredible report tracing the money, which needs to be updated. And this is my agenda. I keep pushing it again and again because it was really like incredible. So they're always there. They've done it again and again, and they've been doing. And then the whole question about this Christian fundamentalist and whiteness, white supremacy, and this. So I've discovered in all of this stuff, I've been receiving this request for public record from this woman, Nicole Neely or whatever, who is actually Parents Defending Education. And Parents Defending Education mobilize the whole thing at Syracuse University to cancel a lecture of mine. And they also send their public record request parents, which is ridiculous because students are already over 18 years old. So why are their parents getting involved? It's not the kindergarten, it's not minors. Parents, it's just, I mean, it should be an insult to the students, but they came, and the university is actually just engaging them. But she sent a request from my university asking for my personal communication questions about educators for Palestine, teaching why Muslim, Israel, Hamas, Gaza, apartheid, Zionism, Zionist genocide, between October 7th and February 5th. This is kind of particular period, kind of like this is all my personal information anyway. This has nothing to do with the university. And of course, the university is pressuring again and again. But it's very interesting because when I looked her up, the whole engagement, which you referred to, Sarah, and everybody did, about what she is doing there, the parents against defending education, they have a very big attack against ethnic studies, against critical race and race theory, of course, against Ahmed. They'd like to shut us down because they are very much invested in continuing the prevailing white supremacy and shutting down any possibilities to question any Eurocentrism in the curriculum. They do not want students, they do not want kids to learn about the histories of settler colonialism, whether it is in this country, North America, the Americas, or anywhere in the world. Because and this is, we see that a lot in Florida, maybe the most vulgar expression of it, but we see it all over the world. And of course, Palestine has been the project and the attack, the victim of Amcha Stand With Us in the California legislature and the attack about the ethics studies curriculum, because when people think and engage in critical thinking, they're going to start asking questions. So shut it down, then nobody is able to actually access material. And people don't access material, they do not know what's going on. So they'll believe the narratives that come from dominant. So this is that it's very, very interesting, kind of like what are they trying to do, and why is it that they're very much engaged in addition to what they're doing on. The other thing is, and you all referred to it, is the whole thing is, why do they want to erase Palestine? If you want to realize the slogan land without people, you have to erase the people and you have to erase the relationship with the land. I mean, there is viciousness, there is hatred, there is nastiness, but it's like an equation. You have to do it. And you have to show that the people who are on the land are actually damaging the environment, damaging the land, and the Zionist settlers who are coming in are actually making the desert bloom. They're very kind to the environment. So this whole greenwashing becomes a very nice tale. It's a very nice narrative that is very seductive and very beautiful to make it possible. So then even all the stuff by Christian Zionists works. So it actually replaces not only a very violent, displacing people who are there, but also replacing it with another narrative that's easily accessible and consumed by people. Say, oh, this makes a lot of sense and it's closer to God. So the whole thing that they do, the parks, all the parks, killing olive trees and putting in front of them all these European trees that keep getting burned again and again and again, because they're not part of the environment. But this continues coming up again and again. So there is this whole question that all the parts of the equation, the ideological, the connection, the hatred, the genocide against people, the destruction of the people, the propaganda, the discourse, all of them work with each other. So it's kind of like when people say, why is it? Why do they hate? Not why do they hate us? Like the US says after 9/11, 2001. It's not about, I mean, part of it, yes, it is part of that, because you need mobilize people to be able to kill and not feel bad about it, to be able to wear women's underwear what they find, to play in people's homes. Yes, but it's not the only part of the story. There are material conditions to that, which you all alluded to. The interest in doing something of this sort, the interest is actually fueling sectarian violence. I mean, with the whole question with the colonial powers, when they leave, the British left colonialism, leaves India and leaves in its place its sectarian rule. The French leave Lebanon and leave in its place the 1943 constitution. That's a sectarian rule. Israel is trying very hard to keep a sectarian violence in Lebanon, and they keep failing because now it is the Sunni and the Shiite and everybody and their cousins fighting them. So they are having very hard time to figure out how can we actually make sure that there are certain part of the sectarian politics is going on, because divide and rule is a very important rule of colonialism, and they keep doing it again and again. So it also has a very important function to keep people together and separate Hindus from Muslims and so on. And I have to say, Aisha, for us historically, the India was part of, like, we always thought of India on our mind. This is the India of Nehru that was part of the non-aligned movement that was with Nasser and so on. So it was very hard to swallow that this is where India is going. And it's kind of like when people say this is Islamophobia, there are pogroms and there is genocide and there is massacres. It's very difficult to believe that because everybody wants to think the subaltern studies and the post-colonial and the whole thing, but it's very real. And this is part of actually working on all these sectarian violences and so on. The other thing that I wanted to kind of like just the whole like race, the class issues, which Sarah, you talked about that. Everybody talked about that. The whole question about Zionism and also the elitism of Zionists, making it very much invested in Europeanness and looking down on. Actually, at one point, even the Zionists who were anti-Semitic, who wanted to kind of like keep Zionists who were activists and so on out of there and maintain the Europeanness and so on, kind of like the assimilationists, right? In a different way. And so there is this whole thing, elitism, that is very much part of it, that's very class connected and very much connected to the capitalism, to the capital production of the European colonialism. So I think this is something that it would be really kind of like really important. The last, I think, a couple of points I want to say is the whole question with the US and how is it also like accounting for why white supremacy gets so nasty and gets, historically, of course, every single time people of color, indigenous people make gains, there is something about they believe that is their God-given rights. So why is it that Black people are actually like fighting for their rights? They're not supposed to, because this is settlers. As a Palestinian, we know this. This is what the Israeli settler mentality is like. How dare you? And I think this is also part of any time people fight for their rights, stand up and fight. Palestinians, live Palestinians, not dead Palestinians, is a big problem. They are supposed to submit, they're supposed to be defeated, and so on. So that's a very big part. But so when you have somebody like Obama, no matter how much we criticize him, become president in the White House, that also becomes a very mobilizing cry for white supremacists. And I think it's a similar, I agree with you, Aisha, nothing is the same. You cannot conflate context. But it is something about kind of like, it's easier to mobilize. How dare you stand up and challenge us? We are always used to our privilege. So there is the material conditions and the political conditions that come together. And this is something that, and I think the last point I would say is kind of like the understanding of nationalism and how nationalism works in an anti-colonial context versus nationalism that would work like in Nazism, in fascism with Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, and so on. How it mobilizes, let's say, not only white supremacy and the most recent like renditions of it, but also the Tea Party that came before, and it starts mobilizing against, don't you dare allow Blacks to take over the White House. Don't you dare. And we see that again. This is not, by the way, an endorsement of Kamala Harris. So I'm just going to be very clear. I'm not voting for her. I'm not supporting her. I'm just being very, very clear about that. But this is something about how do you mobilize on racial grounds too. So how do you enlist racial capitalism as well in mobilizing white supremacy and in likening Zionism and as well as Hindutva about raising the middle class upward mobility for a particular sector of the population, because we do know that there is a particular sector of population in Israel, including the military, who actually end up being part of the elitist military parts of the computer industries, the Silicon Valley, the most top elite. And I think this is something that's also happening similarly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there is something about that kind of like gives you more privileges as it, and I don't think it also works with everybody, because there is a lot of people who are being mobilized around white supremacy as well. So, but the question is, how does this really work? Does this really, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm asking, I'm raising this question. Does this really work with Christian Zionists? Does it work in kind of like mobilizing them? Like come to these all trips and pay over $5,000. Who can afford $5,000? It's not free. It's not birthright Israel. Come and come to these. Where is the material issues comes in? It's not, Adelson is not paying for this. How does this work in order to be facilitated by a certain class status? And does it really work to eliminate, like sort of like, let's say, Jewish Zionism, supremacy, Jewish supremacy, nationalism, and so on? Does it work to eliminate the differences between classes, or is it something only about supremacy? Is it? Or is there something else that we need to? I'm going to stop there because I'm sorry because I was intrigued by everything you presented. So I'm
It's
throwing it back at you.
fantastic. There's a couple of questions, and then we
Yeah.
did have some slides we want to end with about the sort of so what, and how do we organize around this?
Do you wanna have? But you want me to manage that, Sarah? The
You
question.
can manage the questions. I just pulling them out. There was one up above about what we mean by anti-Semitism, and then there's two right here at the bottom about so if you want to read them, that's great. I feel there's different questions and a comment that you might want to respond to, Aisha, about Gandhi and Nehru and caste. But it kind of gets to your question, right? About
Is this the
is
question?
it enough? Is challenging the supremacy enough towards the material liberation via the elite? But so that might be a good ending place for us. But I think there are some specific questions. So
Are you mentioning? Are you referring to the question? Are you using the term anti-Semitic to
Yeah.
mean anti-Jewish and specifically exclusively? If so, could you say anti-Jewish instead? If that's what you mean, using anti-Semitic as if it's equivalent to of anti-Jewish exclusively, inquisitively erases Semites who are not Jewish. So it actually goes kind of like rectifying some of the historical narrative and so on. So this is from Camille Tayyara. And okay, Camille also continues saying, where is it? I've been told it was actually the Nazis who began to use the term Semites, anti-Semite to refer exclusively to Jews. And if you want to, when you're responding to that, can you please also talk about the whole exceptionalism of one genocide versus other genocides?
yes, absolutely.
Because there were a few comments about how many indigenous people died, and somebody mentioned it, but how many African peoples were killed in the
Africans in the slave trade.
So
and then there's also this thing about unite the right, and then I want to give time for the Christian white nationalist question, Jenny, and I don't know, Aisha, if you want to respond to this thing about the caste privilege piece, which I think is pretty well known about Gandhi and Nehru, but you may want to say something. And then we just want to make sure we point to some of the organizing. Okay, so the term anti-Semitism was formed by William Marr in 1879, and it was very specifically a European concept again of being anti-Jewish. The term Semite more broadly does mean a larger group of people, and again is this sort of very European disparaging both internal colonial the colonial orientation internal to Europe, and then its external its global colonization. And so it's both and. Anti-Semitism, and why we don't capitalize Semitism is for the exact reasons you're saying. Semites are a broader group of people. So when we spell out anti-Semitism lowercase and all together, we are referring to the European use of anti-Semitism. Yes, Semitic started as a language group, and so we are referring to a historically specific term that was created within Europe, and we are distinguishing it from anti-Jewish sentiment that may come from other places, like including Zionism. And then so what we're trying to distinguish, and I heard what you said, Aisha, about anti-Semitism being structural. And it is true that historically it was structural, but right here in the United States today, there is no structural, there is not government power behind it. And that's important because when there's a difference between feeling, when Jewish people say they're unsafe or they're being targeted, there's a difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe. And it's important to distinguish between anti-Jewish sentiment that might emerge because Israel conflates itself as a Jewish state when it's really a Zionist state, and traditional anti-Semitism, which is a European concept, which is then different than the Semitic group of people. So the way we rectify that is we lowercase anti-Semitism to mean that historical reference. And you may or may not agree with it, but for us, it's important to distinguish that from the misuse of it to label people who criticize Israel. So it's important to articulate the historical nature of it. And then I saw a lot of questions, and then the exceptionalizing. We have done a lot of work on this, and we did a tour with someone named Hayo Meyer called Never Again for Anyone. And we call it not the Holocaust, IJAN, we call it the Nazi genocide, because part of our work in dismantling anti-Zionism, in dismantling Zionism as anti-Zionists, is to stop the isolation and exceptionalizing that Zionism does that actually separates our own history of opposition to fascism, our own struggles against fascism and genocide, and our participation in joint struggle in labor movements, but all sorts of movements. And Zionism separates and builds on Jewish exceptionalism, which is also a thread in Jewish history. And so we oppose that. And so we talk about it, the Nazi genocide, to place it alongside other genocides. And there isn't a Holocaust. There are multiple Holocausts. There are multiple genocides, and they have all been and continue to be horrific. And they are unique in their ways. And then they share dehumanization and brutal fascism and colonization. So I hope that answered your question. It's too much to get into. There are so many collaborations. Jabotinsky was trained by Mussolini. There are so many collaborations between white nationalists, fascists, and Zionists, and that is true here in the United States. And it's a bigger conversation, and I understand that it's confusing, but they have a tactical alliance. They have a tactical alliance with different end games, but they refer to each other, and some of their end games are similar. In the same way that Aisha spoke to, you need to distinguish between Hindutva and Zionism, but see their commonalities, see their alliances, see the practical ways they work together, the biggest purchaser of arms. And that's also true with Christian Zionism. So I will turn it over to you, Jenny, to respond.
Thanks so much. I wanted to respond to the kind of thread of questions that are about Christian Zionism in the chat. And one is, what are the current rhetorical and political strategies of Christian white nationalists and Zionist alliance that we should be aware of in the US? And I think this connects to what Rabab was talking about in terms of these kinds of mobilizations of greenwashing narratives that are endemic to how Israel sells itself. And a lot of this is, of course, through tourism, but what it does is it repeats this rhetoric. And the part I appreciate about this question is like the rhetorical and political strategies, because it repeats this rhetoric of Israel restoring Palestine to its biblical beauty, right? And so this is a colonial tactic, right, shared across multiple contexts, that is about when, like, manifest destiny, right? Like when a land is considered God-given, and when settlers claim responsibility for restoring that land to its God-given beauty, which papers over the destruction settlers caused to the land, right, to then have to restore it. And it also refuses to see native cultivation of the land. So when I teach this to my students, I talk about how settlers in California refused to see the kind of flora and fauna of the land as deliberate. It was just wild beauty, and refused to see like indigenous cultivation of land as a strategy of colonialism. And so that's endemic to Christian Zionism, not only in how it positions its relationship to tourism to support tourism to Israel that itself displaces Palestinians, but it also is part of a logic of US support for Israeli state violence that's even sort of central to things like Mark Twain talking about Palestine, right? Mark Twain talking about Palestine that was about like restore, like it's so marred by its current inhabitants, right? Which erases indigeneity, which erases rights to the land, erases land back initiatives, so degraded by its current inhabitants, and it needs to be restored to its beauty. So that's one current rhetorical and political strategy of Christian white nationalist and Zionist alliance in the US that has a material corollary on the ground in terms of facilitating displacement through things like afforestation, right? Through things like planting cypress and fir and pine, and people planting a tree in Israel that papers over Palestinian villages that Israel has destroyed. So Israel itself facilitates this destruction and then claims responsibility for its renewal. And you see that also in the way that northern Gaza and all of Gaza, right, is being marketed touristically to settlers as a place that's going to be restored after it's destroyed. So these narratives and logics of destruction as a stepping stool to renewal that is biblically grounded and given is part of that logic. And so I think being aware of those. Another question is about uniting the right rally with being a Zionist movement. How do you rationalize that? And I think that gets to what Sarah was talking about earlier in terms of like who becomes bedfellows in supporting Zionism, right? And it's a lot of kind of like shrugginess around the nature of who is supporting Israel and why. And so it happens anytime any like Zionists are questioned about the support of Christian Zionists, is like, how can you accept the support of Christian Zionists when they're so anti-Semitic? But their answer, right, is a shrugginess about like, well, it's because Christian Zionists fund so much of what we do, and so it becomes this acceptable alliance, but it also is just rooted completely in a shared logic of facilitating the exile of Palestinians. And so I think and as we sort of talk about what this organizing looks like and the Christian anti-Zionist organizing that's in response to Christian Zionism can make those alliances clear, and also trace not only their kind of like alliances with each other, but also their alliances around particular issues. So like, what does parents attacking education around ethnic studies have to do with Christian Zionist alliances, have to do with white nationalism, have to do with Moms of Liberty and all these other kinds of anti-trans legislation, climate change denial, right? Like all of these, what do these coalitions reveal, and how are they shaped, and how are organizations on the ground working to like reveal those connections and combat them in their own communities?
Can I just say something before I turn it over to you, Aisha? Because it's not about the Jews. It's not about Jews. The Unite the Right white supremacists are all about replacement theory, whether here in the US or either France or Germany or anywhere else. It's not about Jews. They have relationship with Israel as a power, whether they ideologically think that's going to bring the Messiah, or whether they strategically believe that it's going to be a very good, important for Western power, whatever it is, they still want to get rid of the Jews. It's not about, getting rid of anti-Semitism. It's about Israel as a power. So it has nothing to do with combating anti-Semitism. So, look, people really need to read replacement theory again. I'm just, we're like, why? Why is that an issue? Like, Trump. Yes, Trump is going to be their hero because the hero for Israel. He's not the hero for Jews, and he's not going to be saved Jews. And so, anyway, I'm sorry. I get like, others. Sorry, Aisha.
So Aisha, and then we are at time, and then we'll just need to wrap, but we said we'll send out resources to people.
Yeah, I don't have anything. I mean, I'll read Samir's comment out loud, and I really appreciate it. We didn't have time for like going into all of the nuances, but always happy to host like we could do a full webinar on even the connections between Hindutva and Zionism, or just a deep dive on Hindutva, and like maybe you'll like figure out more connections on your own as well. But I'll read Samir's comment out loud, which is just that it's also important to name the nuances around how Gandhi and Nehru were also caste privileged and casteist too, while acknowledging they were in solidarity with Palestine. So like them being like India being like publicly in solidarity with Palestine until the 90s, those folks were still like oppressing others within the nation. So I mean, it's not like, yeah, just like there's like a lot of context. But yeah, we'll send over resources for folks to learn more as well. Thank you.
Thank you all. I thought it was 2 hours, but maybe we can do something more about building on this discussion here, and also like talking about what would be next steps, what other things people can do, how can they educate in the communities and so on.
I mean, just one
Uh,
quick piece is, as
Mm.
many of us have been involved in, there is so much important work happening around what arms embargo, weapons manufacturing, surveillance, and those are some of the campaigns that get to the material connections. But there's other pieces of it that you pointed to, Rabab, that are about how do we help in all of the different kinds of social justice and liberation work we do, how do we help people understand why these connections are so relevant, and therefore why these struggles are so intersected? And so I think that's a big piece of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's really important. What you're doing is really important, because people only want immediate action. And that's really important. But it's also important what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and how do we analyze it. Also, it's always been part of changing, long-term change as well, not only short-term change. So thank you so much. It's really lots of labor for love. Your work is really amazing. Thank you for continuing to do it, especially in these terrible times. And, people in Gaza, when they hear what's going on in the US, it uplifts their spirit. And I keep saying, when I hear the news from Gaza in Arabic, they always, they always boast what's going on in the US. So I think it's really important. People should not despair and should continue doing what they're doing. So thank you. The history will be ours. Lots of love to everybody.
Well, thank you for your time.
Of course, you too.
Yeah.